the talk today is the defective propaganda. And as Teresa was saying, this is the first time we're presenting it. So we're really looking forward for feedback. Last time I presented the paper in Melissa's WIP. The paper got published today, the thing that I presented. So hopefully they'll continue next time. So the problem that we're going to discuss is whether propaganda is somehow defective or not, by which we roughly mean we'll be more precise in what follows. Roughly mean whether it's has a positive connotation or a negative connotation, the term and the phenomenon as well. Next slide, please. So the summary of the talk, the template of the talk will be brief introduction. Then we'll look at Cheryl Tuttle-Ross's model of propaganda, counter-propaganda, which we think is particularly promising and deserves perhaps more attention than it has gotten so far. But we will be adding a few elucidations or refinements to it in order to make it sure that we understand it in a way that it's adequate to capture the phenomenon of propaganda. Then we will look at two recent attempts to argue that propaganda is, in fact, sometimes or can be sometimes a positive phenomenon, or at least a neutral phenomenon, so not necessarily negative. And one of them is by Cheryl Tuttle-Ross herself, who revised their initial model on which propaganda was indeed negatively connotated, and made it into a model in which propaganda can be positive. So we will look at her revised model. We will present some critiques of a revised model. And then we'll look at another recent account of propaganda, which makes propaganda to be sometimes positive or neutral. And we'll Jason Stanley's 2015 account, and we will criticize that account as well. Next slide, please. So the term propaganda in English has various meanings. The etymology of it is Latin, goes back to the 17th century when the Catholic Church instituted this department called the Sacra Congregatio Propaganda Fide, which had at its main purpose that of spreading the word of the Gospels, essentially. This was particularly important in those times because of, well, a bunch of reasons, but mainly the Reformation, and that had split the church into different branches, and then the new colonies in America that needed to be converted to Catholicism if at all possible, and so on. But the religious meaning was then sort of replaced with the years, especially in the 20th century, to acquire what we take to be the predominant meaning in English today, which is a political meaning. So, for instance, the OED has this as the political sense of propaganda, which we take to be predominant, and we also take the dictionaries to take as predominant, which is the systematic dissemination of information, especially in a biased or misleading way, in order to promote a political cause or point of view. So what we want to do is to offer a descriptively adequate account of propaganda under this sense of the term propaganda in English. So any of the sort of other meanings, either the religious meaning or in some languages, which we won't be talking about, right? So we'll be focused on English, but in some languages, for instance, Spanish and other languages, the term also has other meanings, right? So for instance, in Spanish, we say propaganda electoral, which doesn't mean anything nefarious, right? It's just a separate sense of the word, in which it just means political canvassing. I guess that would be the term in English, right? But those senses are not senses we'll be focusing on, or languages we'll be focusing on. So we take this meaning, political meaning of propaganda that I just that you can see from the OED, more or less, as the predominant meaning of the word propaganda in English. And it refers to a set of cases, and some of these most paradigmatic cases that are discussed in the scholarship on propaganda are Nazi propaganda, so you know, Hitler's speeches, Leni Riefenstahl's movies. There's some of them. The magazine Der Stürmer, which started early on in the 30s, in the early 30s, presenting a negative image of the Jews and sending other sorts of messages that were favorable to the Nazis, and sort of effective in, or at least meant to be effective in spreading the Nazi Party's ideals. Bolshevik propaganda, propaganda by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia to support their alleged social engineering programs, and going against all sorts of dissidents of the regime, but also things that don't involve direct use of mass violence, but are also sort of cases of propaganda. So, for instance, the tobacco companies' propaganda campaigns or marketing campaigns in the 50s and 60s to promote the use of tobacco, or at least sort of hide the negative effects, negative health effects that tobacco was increasingly being shown to produce. And we take these cases to be different from, on the one hand, mere advertising, and on the other hand, from disinformation. Now, difference to advertising is one of the differences that, so when I say advertising, I also mean related phenomena, marketing, public announcements, and so on. These are cases that are not necessarily negative, and they are typically accepted in contemporary democratic societies. So they should be distinguished from propaganda, and indeed they are distinguished by and large in our ordinary use of the term. And propaganda is also distinct, we think, in a significant way from these other phenomena that are often called disinformation, but now are increasingly being called in slightly different ways, and I guess slightly different phenomena, So disinformation, misinformation, malinformation is the new one, fake news, and these kinds of phenomena. We take these are have a negative connotation, but they're primarily verbal or propositional in nature. They primarily refer to verbal or propositional phenomena and messages, right? Whereas propaganda is can use a much wider variety of tools. Next slide, please. And so the question under discussion is, as we said, is it propaganda necessarily negative or defective? We use defectiveness here in as a sort of an umbrella term for any expressions with a negative connotation, something like bad or less than ideal, although we will refine the term later on. But sort of for now, defectiveness just means something like bad. As I was saying, some prominent theorists of propaganda have recently been arguing that propaganda is not essentially negative. We think this is surprising, in part because their analysis focus primarily on paradigmatic cases of propagandistic phenomena, which, as we've seen before, the Nazi cases, the Bolshevik cases, Khmer Rouge cases, are indeed uncontroversially defective or negative or problematic. In the case of Ross, this is also surprising in light of the fact that Ross herself had previously given a definition of propaganda, which we think is very promising, and that stressed the negative features of the term. Next slide, please. Right, so we'll be arguing that Ross's initial model is an adequate account with some elucidations, as I've said, and argue that the examples offered by Ross and by Stanley that are meant to illustrate alleged neutral positive instances of propaganda fail because they either are not propaganda, and in Stanley's case, even on his own definition of propaganda, or because they actually have negative features. Next slide. So Ross's initial model of propaganda from 2002, we think captures the extension of the phenomenon and at the same time highlights what is problematic about propaganda. So the initial or her own sort of succinct definition of the model, which she called the epistemic merit, which she calls the epistemic merit model, is that propaganda is an epistemically defective message used with the intention to persuade a socially significant group of people on behalf of political institution, organization, or cause. Next slide. Now let's see how this account fares. This sort of succinct definition, at least, of the account fares against earlier accounts of propaganda. Now, we distinguish between three different kinds of early definitions of propaganda. I note that all of the early definitions that we discuss are capturing the negative connotation that we take to be essential to the term. Now, of course, not all early definition of propaganda, or not all definition of propaganda have been positive, but it's interesting that in the case in which, perhaps interesting in the case in which they have not been negatively connoted, this definition, the proponents were sort of uncontroversially now can be characterized as sort of people who were putting forward an agenda that was not straightforwardly positive, right? So for instance, Edward Bernays, who was sort of main figure in the US behind sort of actual cases of propaganda, so someone sort of a consultant for actual case of propaganda, relative of Freud's as well. defined propaganda as a consistent, enduring effort to create or shape events to influence the relations of the public to an enterprise, idea, or group, right? So on Bernays' definition, propaganda seems to be quite neutral. So there are some exceptions that are that have some interesting features. But the early definitions that we'll be talking here all try to capture the negative connotation of the term. So one type of early definition of propaganda is an attempt at communication, or is a piece of communication that impedes the search for reasons in the audience or something like that, right? So for instance, Institute Propaganda Analysis, 1938, in the US, defined propaganda in part as an expression or action by individuals that is designed to influence other people's opinions or actions towards a predetermined end. And even more precisely, the psychologist Frederick Bartlett in 1940 defined it as an attempt to influence public opinion conduct, especially social opinion conduct, in such a manner that the persons who adopt the opinions and behaviors do so without themselves making any definite search for reasons. Now, the problem with stay on the, please. Now, the problem with the no search for reasons type of definitions are that they admit of exceptions, both on the sufficient and on the necessary side. On the sufficient side, they fail to distinguish from, say, instances of a scientist, well-intentioned, virtuous scientists' efforts to convince their colleagues of a discovery or a claim, a scientific claim that they make, right? Now that doesn't seem to be propaganda, even though it might not necessarily involve searching for reasons, right? Or even think about computer manuals or weather forecasts or things like those, right? The weatherman or the weather woman is, giving you the weather, right? It's not trying to propagandize you, but at the same time, it's not trying to give you reasons for why they think that today in Barcelona, tomorrow in Barcelona will rain or will not rain, right? So they have their models. They're not explaining them to you, but that doesn't mean that they're propagandizing, right? And then it's also not necessary, because you can think of cases of propaganda that work by instilling excessive skepticism in audiences, right? By saying, well, climate change is a problem, and 90% of scientists believe that climate change is a problem, it's human-made, and so on and so forth. But, can we actually trust the models? Can we really know whether these scientists are telling the truth, and so on and so forth, right? I'm not taking sides here either way, but I'm just giving an example of what sort of a propaganda by means of excessive skepticism could be. So then next slide, please. So then the next type of definition of propaganda is the falsehoods propaganda. So propaganda involves some kind of falsehood, right? So for instance, you can think of British allegations during World War I. The Germans ate babies and impaled children on their bayonets, and that was just war propaganda, telling British people and the world falsities, right, to the end of winning the war or engaging in the war, and so on and so forth, right? But again, this is not neither necessary or sufficient for propaganda, right? It's not necessary because oftentimes propagandists don't tell falsehoods, but they may, for instance, cherry pick true data, right? So think about National News Service of a country at war might choose to report on a battle where its military losses were light, but to ignore or not talk about another battle where its losses were heavy, right? And that is meant to convince the public or the audience that the war is going well for that country, without saying anything false, right? They, but by neglecting some pieces of information. Also not sufficient as falsehoods is not sufficient for propaganda, for defining propaganda, because there are cases of just normal deception, right? I just tell a fib or tell a big lie or whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean that every time I say something false, I'm propagandizing, or I'm being a propagandist. And then the third type of definition, next slide, please, is the appeal to rational emotions, right? So for instance, again, the Institute of Propaganda Analysis had this other definition of propaganda on which propaganda appeals to our emotions rather than to our reasons, or to our reason rather, and makes us believe and do something that we would not believe or do if we thought about it calmly, dispassionately. Again, this is quite a popular type of definition. In fact, we'll see that Stanley might be seen as in part endorsing this type of definition, but it isn't a good definition, we say, because and other people have pointed out, because again, neither necessary nor sufficient for something to count as propaganda. Now, this Bertrand Russell already made something like this point, but again, think about the tobacco companies in the 50s and 60s trying to undermine public confidence in scientific evidence and established links between smoking and, say, cancer, through arguments, scientific studies, and so on, that presented themselves as factual and scientific. They did not appeal to any emotional reactions, let alone any rational emotional reactions, but they counted as propaganda, we think. And then also, it's not a sufficient definition, it's not sufficient for defining propaganda, because of course you can have, a kid's temper tantrums, sort of appeal to rational emotions to get the toy that they want, but that obviously is not, well, we think it's obviously not a case of propaganda. Next slide, please. So Ross's epistemic merit model, again, let's repeat it and to see whether we can make it better, but it's already sort of, let's repeat the Ross's definition. So propaganda is an epistemically defective message used with the intention to persuade a socially significant group of people on behalf of a public political institution, organization, or cause, right? So we think that this definition avoids the pitfalls that the three types of definitions we earlier considered were sort of prone to, but at the same time captures most of the, or all of the bad making features of propaganda, right? So let's see how we can analyze this account. So the Ross's account is made up of three main parts, right? And this is already on her own account, because she's explicitly referencing a sort of, maybe she doesn't talk about Grice, but she's sort of obviously talking about a Gricean account of communication on which propaganda is a communicative act, right? So as a communicative act, will have a message, right? So in this case, the communicative act C conveys an epistemically defective message, has a sender of the message, So C conveys an epistemically defective message that is used by or on behalf of a social or political institution, organization, or cause with the intention to persuade. Right, so type of sender, type of intention, and then an intended receiver, which is a socially significant group of people. Okay. So what is an epistemically defective message for Ross's account? So it's a message that, as she defines it, is either false, inappropriate, or connected to other beliefs in ways that are inapt, misleading, or unwarranted. Okay, so yes, so please move on to the next slide. So yeah, epistemically defective message is by definition a message is either false, inappropriate, or connected to other beliefs in ways that are inapt, misleading, or unwarranted. Now, we want to make some elucidations and possibly refinements of this of Ross's account. We're not claiming that they are not all of them, or that they are not included already in Ross, but we think it's either they're not in Ross's account, some of them, or they are sort of in need of elucidation, of clarification in a way that we think is useful to make it an even better account of propaganda, right? So the first elucidation concerns the focus of Ross's account on the badness of the message, right? So she talks about the message being bad or epistemically defective. And we want to point out that the badness, the message itself is not necessary in a strict sense. The message is not necessarily the problem, right? As a locutionary act, right? So there are sorry, let me, where is it? Yeah, so so the message, the defectiveness of a propaganda communication might not lie in the falsity of the message, strictly speaking, right? So think, for instance, again, the case of the propaganda, the news agency being involved in propagandizing how a certain country is doing in a war, right? Now, they're not saying anything false, right? So the message, strictly speaking, the locutionary message is not defective because it doesn't fail, say, Rice's conversational maximum of quality, right? It is not false that the country X has been doing well in this particular battle, right? But by omitting the other battles where the country is not doing well at all, it's failing, for instance, in this case, Rice's maximum of quantity, right? So it's omitting relevant information. And so we need to understand the message that is epistemically defective in a broad sense, not just in terms of falsity. The other elucidation concerns the kind of speech acts that can be involved in propaganda, right? And we want to say that it's not always the case that propaganda involves constitutive speech acts, right? So it doesn't always involve asserting, describing, testifying, right? So, for instance, there's a famous case of a genocidaire, someone who committed genocide in Rwanda, called and politician called Léon Mugesera. He uttered an influential speech during the Rwanda War, I think, that whose content was mostly a command, right? So his famous words were, "Do not let yourself invaded," right? And that command was considered propaganda. But obviously, being a command wasn't a constitutive speech act, so it wasn't epistemically defective in the straightforward way in which an assertion can be epistemically defective, but we think was epistemically defective anyway, because it presupposed that their fellow Rwandans, or the Tutsi, were foreigners, which was false, right? So do not hear yourself invaded is making the Tutsis as a foreign body into the country against which we have to fight, right? Or the Hutus had to fight, and that was a false presupposition. And the third elucidation is about features of the sender. So Ross only says, as we saw earlier, Ross only says the Community Act cancels propaganda if and only if is used, as a message that conveys an epistemic defective message that is used by or on behalf of a social or political institution, organization, or cause with the intention to persuade. Now, as it is, we think there's a danger of that account also including things like teaching in high school, or maybe in the early years of high school, depending on the system where you are, teaching, say, Newtonian physics or classical physics, right, in 2023. So after Einstein's relativity revolution. Now, is that an epistemically defective message sent by or on behalf of a social or political institution, the nation's education agency, the teacher employed by that nation's education agency, with the intention to persuade the kids in school? Yes, but it doesn't count as propaganda, right? So we want to add that the message should be sent with direct political ends, right? And then final elucidation is that the propagandist concerns the propagandist's awareness of their message's epistemic defectiveness, right? So we think that there's an ambiguity in sort of Ross's definition between a dedicto and a de re reading of what counts an epistemically defective message, right? So just a second. So the dedicto reading would be that the propagandist tends to persuade by using an epistemically defective message under their description, right? So the propagandist is aware that that is an epistemically defective message, right? But the problem with this is that we think a model like this would be too restrictive, because it would exclude propaganda done by so-called true believers, right? So people who actually are not aware that this is that what they're spreading is an epistemically defective message, right? So we think the dicto interpretation is too restrictive. A de re interpretation, the propagandists needn't be aware that the message they use in their attempt to persuade is epistemically defective, even though in fact it happens to be, right? So think, for instance, of a politician reads the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, acquires the belief that global warming at 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during the 21st century unless drastic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades, right? So this politician goes out and spreads the word and tries their best to convince their fellow citizens that something needs to be done. The Earth is going to warm up of more than 2 degrees Celsius during this century. And then it turns out that, we make a breakthrough in climate science or whatever, and we realize that actually this was not true, right? But the politician was convinced that it was true. And so we don't think that would count as propaganda. So a direct reading would actually be too restrictive, right? Okay, so blah blah blah. So these are the sorry. So what we mean to propose to fix this dilemma between a dedicto and a de re reading is that the propagandist is or should have been aware of the message's defectiveness, right? So in the case of the true believer, they are not aware, but they should have been, right? Because say they're true believers in some crazy horrible ideology that it's obviously morally wrong. But the politician who believes in climate change is not a propagandist because there wasn't an expectation or an epistemic norm on them that they should have been aware of the message's defectiveness, because say the science wasn't available yet, right? So the final account that we think best captures propaganda is a communicative act C counts as propaganda if and only if message star C conveys an epistemically defective message in a broad sense, C implies or implicates a message either false, inappropriate, or connected to other beliefs in ways that are inapt, misleading, or unwarranted, given C's illocutionary and perlocutionary intents. Sender stars that C communicative act is produced by or on behalf of a social or political institution, organization, or cause with the intention to persuade for direct political ends. 3, receiver is a socially significant group of people. And then condition 4, which is added, which we've added, make sure that the producers of the communicative act C either are or are aware, sorry, either are or should have been aware of the epistemic defectiveness of the message. Now I've lost, because I've got so much on my screen. I think we probably, yes, no, we are on the right one. So next, please, next slide, please. Thanks. Pass that. And so surprisingly to us, but again, we think it's part of a wider trend in the literature, recent trend in the literature. Ross in 2013, so 11 years after the first account, denies the necessity for propaganda to be epistemically defective, right? And instead puts the condition that propaganda might also be epistemically, so either is epistemically defective or it's epistemically merited. So what is an example? The main example, well, indeed, the only example that she uses at length in her 2013 paper to argue that propaganda can be epistemically merited or you know, can have positive a positive connotation or can be positive in nature, is a group, a series of protests and solidarity sing-alongs that happened in 2011 in and around, in or and outside the Wisconsin Capitol building. This was, yes, you did right to change the slide. This was the target of these protests was a budget repair bill that had been introduced by the recently inaugurated governor of Wisconsin, that was Scott Walker. And over the course of 3 weeks, the protesters in Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, often sang new lyrics set to all the tunes, such as this one, set to the tune of "Oh Susanna." I'm going to try and So it's like, oh, Scott Walker, now don't you mess with me. I come from Wisconsin with a sign for you to see. Okay, so these were the kinds of protests and songs that people were singing. And Ross says that these kinds of cases have to make us change the account of propaganda. She's never completely clear in her paper whether she's only claiming that these are cases of propaganda or these are cases of protests that have propaganda power. But she does talk about changing the account and revising the account. So it seems most charitable to us to think that she actually thinks these are cases of propaganda. And if she thinks that, our objections that we don't think the Wisconsin sing-along protests falsify original model of propaganda. So on the one hand, if the kind of evidence that she gives is indicative of the epistemic defectiveness of the protests, right? And we think that her account of these protests is under-described, right? So it's not obvious that these cases were epistemically defective, right? So if that's the case, then they amount to propaganda under Ross's original definition, right? But if they are indeed epistemically merited, as she claims them to be, then we would say that these are kinds of protests. They're not kinds of propaganda, right? So they're non-propagandistic protests, I guess, right? So she tries to argue that the solidarity sing-along is epistemically merited. One thing that she says is that the lyrics wear their literary tropes openly and enable an audience to separate hyperbole from truth or caricature from fact, right? We don't think this is obviously enough to make something not epistemically defective. So again, another case from the Rwandan genocide, another genocidaire, Leopold Twagi Rayezu, had this quote. He said, before we could fool around among ourselves and say we were going to kill them all, and the next moment we would join them to share some work or bottle. Jokes and threats were mixed together. We no longer paid heed to what we said. We could toss around awful words without awful thoughts. The Tutsis didn't even get very upset. I mean, they didn't grow apart because of those unfortunate discussions. Since then, we have seen those words brought on grave consequences, right? So it isn't obvious that sort of separating the literary tropes or separating hyperbole from truth or character from fact is not epistemically defective, right? Or think about sort of anti-Semitic cartoons from the Stürmer in the Nazi times, where it is obvious that the Jew is caricatured, right? It's no one in the audience or no one or not very many people think that that is actually what a Jew looks like. But that doesn't mean that these were not epistemically defective messages or that they had nefarious consequences, right? And then I guess I'm going to skip this because it's taking too long. And then the last thing I want to say is, yes, so we think if these cases that she mentioned, solidarity sing-along cases, are in fact epistemically merited, which, you know, as we said, we have doubts to think that they are actually epistemically merited, which is to say that not defective. Even if they are epistemically merited, then we don't think we should call them propaganda. because we just don't think that we gain any explanatory advantage in blurring the lines between speech acts like protesting, petitioning, or voting on the one end, and acts of propaganda on the other. A speech act can be made to indirectly perform another act, say giving a command by asking a question. By part of reason, propaganda can be made when one testifies, presents a news, or makes a public service announcement. But it doesn't make all testimony, all news services, or all public announcements propaganda. That is, not all forms of large-scale communication, even systematic ones, are propagandistic. So just as we distinguish between the locutionary force of questions and that of commands, the locutionary force of compliments and that of threats, then we should also distinguish between acts of protesting or petitioning and acts of propaganda. So now I leave it to Teresa for the last bit. You're muted, yeah.
I'm unmuted now, I think. Okay. So the other more recent attempt at redefining or giving a new account of propaganda is Jason Stanley's very, very well-known and well-received book on how propaganda works. To give a brief definition that he himself gives, propaganda can be understood as being either supporting or undermining. And then we can ask supporting or undermining of what? And in his words, it is a contribution to a discourse that is presented as an embodiment of ideals elicited through emotional or other non-rational means in a way that either supports or undermines those very same ideals. So note that in referring to emotional or other non-rational means, he seems to be falling under one of the two characterizations, early characterizations of propaganda that we considered early on, and then we thought that would either overgenerate or undergenerate cases of propaganda. And insofar as that is the case, his account might be vulnerable to the same objections that were raised earlier on. Also objectionable, we think, is Stanley's sort of highly metaphorical formulation, which restricts propagandistic attempts to something that is a self-referential embodiment of ideals that support or undermines those very same ideals. Part of the problem here, we think, is that it's not obvious that the supporting or undermining has to be to the same ideals. So I could pretend to be concerned for loyalty or tradition, but do that as a way of undermining, say, principles of equality or of autonomy for other people, say, right? So the ideals in question don't have to be self-referential necessarily, but also we think that there is propaganda that just doesn't need to support or undermine any ideals. They might just be, say, propaganda for Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and people might come to believe or accept things like he has the power to be in two places at the same time, or of flying, or something of the sort. And this has nothing to do with ideals. It's just a way of getting him to have more support or more power over the population in his country. So next slide, please. So we think that it's interesting to look at what Stanley's motivations for his view are. So in the beginning of the book, he says that he has this, we could say it's both a familial and a normative motivation. So he's indebted to his father's work in sociology and his father's commitment to political ideals, namely those of autonomy and freedom specifically. But then he claims, in particularly in a couple of précises of the book, he says that what he was doing is trying to start from a neutral standpoint without making any premises of morality or justice, right? So we think that this is a bit already at intention with the earlier motivation to follow in his father's footsteps. And then in several places, he also says that the leading question that he's trying to address is why it is that humans, we present to ourselves or propose ourselves to follow certain ideals, but then our very human negative impulses lead us to undermine those ideals that we set ourselves. And we just don't see that this is a question, answering this question is what is going to tell us what propaganda is or how propaganda works, because the question is just too general. So I might set myself the idea of being a healthier person, or we might set ourselves any other ideals about how to live. And then, as Filippo would put in one of her papers, at say 7 o'clock or earlier when the alarm clock rings, I just turn to the other side and continue to sleep and don't do what I had proposed myself to do the previous day. So the question about how our negative impulses undermines our plans for leading a better life is just too general a question and a motivation for an account of propaganda. Then a more substantial point about how he thinks he can derive the pernicious epistemic effects that propaganda has concern how he presumably departs from the neutral standpoint by saying that in principle he should be able to characterize how material or other inequality is what inevitably leads for their people to develop bad ideologies and then for pernicious epistemic effects to take place. We also think that this is slightly problematic. In particular, we think that you cannot give a definition of inequality when you depart from a merely neutral standpoint, because inequality, in the political sense of inequality that I assume is relevant here, is not mere difference or difference in characteristics among humans. We're talking about a notion of inequality that needs to be grounded in principles of, say, equality or among people, or that have to be justified by political principles themselves. So we don't think that the whole project is well motivated as he frames it in the first place. Okay, but perhaps more interesting than our concerns about how he motivates the whole project and how he sets up the kind of analysis that is looking after is the question of whether or not his account captures a notion of propaganda as something that is bad or defective, or whether he will be able to have some neutral cases of propaganda or even positive cases of propaganda, right? The idea seems to be a bit puzzling because most of the examples that it does discuss are paradigmatic cases of propaganda in this negative or pejorative sense that we have been saying is the phenomenon that, say, social scientists have been concerned about, and of course is aptly described by the predominant sense of the word, as we have said earlier on. So he gives examples of Maoist, Nazi, or racist propaganda, and these are the kind of cases that he discusses throughout the book. But then he does consider some cases that, if he were right, then he would have shown that there might be positive cases of propaganda. So next slide, please. So one of the cases, a possible positive case, would be the case of the Selma March, led by Martin Luther King. Here, Stanley says that what was going on is that this march was organized. Martin Luther King insisted on nonviolence, so that would be an ideal, knowing full well that the marches would be met with extreme violence. And this, he continues, is a paradigm case of democratically acceptable propaganda. Right. So what we have to see is whether this corresponds to his notion of propaganda or to his definitions of propaganda, and whether it is indeed propaganda in any sense, and whether it is a positive or neutral case. So we think that it's unclear what the relevant ideal is going to be in this case, and whether it exemplifies supporting or undermining propaganda. So remember that he thinks that propaganda is either supporting of an ideal or undermining of an ideal. So the question is, what is the ideal, and how is it supporting it, or how is it undermining it? And Stanley's own definition. So if the ideal is nonviolence, as it seems to be, we think it's unfair to Dr. King to say that he was pretending to embody the ideal of nonviolence while trying to undermine the same ideal. If so, it wasn't undermining propaganda. if Dr. King was supporting nonviolence by emotional or other non-rational means, then the Selma March, if it is propaganda, it's not because it is supporting propaganda because of, then it's not supporting propaganda because empathy for people who meet brutal violence is a rational response to that said violence, right? So the idea is to repeat, to make that more clear. Suppose now that Stanley wants to say this is supporting nonviolence, is supporting propaganda, right? By some emotional or non-rational means. The means, that is empathy for people who are met with violence, is not a non-rational response to that violence, and the emotion in question would be apt, and therefore it would also not really amount to supporting propaganda. So on his definition, it's neither supporting nor undermining propaganda. Now, suppose now we take the other consideration that he gives, that Dr. King knew full well that the marches would be met with extreme violence and intended that to be shown to the US public through mass media, through the television, for instance. Now note that if this is the propaganda in question, then it's not propaganda under Stanley's definition of supporting or undermining propaganda, as we said earlier on. Rather, it will be as a political message conveyed on behalf of a political movement through mass media and addressed to a large audience with the intention to persuade. So it would be propaganda, perhaps, but on our own definition. But again, if it were to be on our own definition or on other definitions, it would have to be be defective in some way. And we don't think that it was defective, right? Because Dr. King is not responsible for the violence that people were met with. And we don't think that the emotions that this may elicit are inappropriate emotions to have in the face of this kind of example. Next slide, please. The second discussion and example that Stanley gives of a possibly neutral or positive case of propaganda would be about the writings in the book by Du Bois on his argument for his appeal to liberal democratic ideals to argue against discrimination of Black people. So Du Bois, as Stanley says, is appealing to liberal democratic ideals, in particular the ideal of freedom, to argue against the idea that only white people have freedom or that Black people should be excluded from having said freedom. So what Du Bois's text would tries to do, according to Jason Stanley, is to elicit empathy towards Black people to make the case that freedom doesn't mean freedom just for whites. From this, Stanley concludes that Du Bois's argument is a case of undermining propaganda, since it is a contribution to discourse that undermines certain ideals, the ideals of freedom just for whites. So we think that this is a disingenuous argument that confounds a little what the ideals at stake are, again. And we think that the conclusion is unwarranted, since Du Bois's book is not a case of propaganda, even on Stanley's own definition. The text would count as undermining propaganda if it were presented as embodying the ideal of freedom in order to erode that very same ideal of freedom, but freedom period, not freedom just for whites. And that's not what he's doing. He's arguing that freedom, real freedom, is incompatible with it being restricted for some part of the population. So in particular, with the restriction of freedom of Black people. And thus Du Bois's case doesn't instantiate Stanley's definition of undermining propaganda. Moreover, it can't be that just any argument for or against any ideal will thereby be propaganda. This is another version of a point we've made earlier, that speech acts are not all the same. So a protest is not automatically an act of propaganda. Offering an argument for an ideal or against an ideal is not automatically propaganda. We might be giving proper reasons or try to offer proper reasons in a book, not in a form of mass media, trying to defend or uphold particular principles or philosophical ideas even. So we think, we don't think that Du Bois's writing has no pernicious epistemic effects. and that the points he made were warranted and well supported by the considerations he made, even though he did appeal to empathy. So we think that Stanley hasn't successfully established that there are neutral or positive cases of propaganda, and that, in fact, many of his considerations are otherwise consistent with Ross's original epistemic merit model. Next slide, please. So, and to conclude, we think that a revision or an improvement of Ross's epistemic merit model seems to capture the predominant use of the word propaganda, and that therefore it's a descriptively apt account of the phenomenon of propaganda that social scientists and philosophers have been interested in for the past 100 years or more. As to possible normative or revisionary suggestions, we think that they aren't warranted because they fail to conclusively show that the cases are propaganda, and that they often confound distinct types of speech act types like protests, announcements, adverts, or with propaganda. And we think that it's important to preserve the negative connotation of the term so as to capture the defectiveness of the phenomenon and to be able to properly address it and recognize it wherever it occurs. And this is it. Thank you.